Hey friends, with the arrival of the new year, some of you might be considering some serious lifestyle changes, including changes to your diet. And that's why today's episode is brought to you by Factor. Factor is a meal kit delivery service brought to you by the folks at HelloFresh, and they specialize in satisfying the specific dietary needs of their customers. No matter what your lifestyle, Factor has the meals to help you live it to the fullest, with keto, calorie smart, vegan, and protein plus meals on the menu. Each week, 34 different meals are selected and prepared by Factor's dedicated team of chefs, but only after being approved by dietitians so that you can enjoy delicious food while maintaining your diet goals. You can also round out your meal and replenish your snack supply with an assortment of over 35 snacks, smoothies, juices, and more. Personally, I try my best to keep a healthy diet, but it's not always easy or convenient to source organic ingredients or cook nutritious meals. Factor makes it all really easy for me, and since I'm focusing on my weightlifting while the weather is kind of rough right now, the Protein Plus options are an absolute godsend. I really can't recommend Factor enough, and if you'd like to check them out too, head over to factor75.com or click the link below and use the code LetsRead60 to get 60% off your first Factor box. And now, without further ado, on with today's stories. I was an LAPD officer for 7.5 years, from Easter of 2001 to Halloween of 2008. Most of the time when some civilian asks an ex-cop what it's like to be police, you get some diplomatic answer about how it was challenging yet rewarding, or how they'll still be doing it if it wasn't for whatever injury or incident took them out of the service. I know because I'm guilty of that myself, because honestly, it's just easier to say that than tell the truth. Because the truth is, being a cop sucked. I hated almost every second of it, and if it wasn't for the fine men and women that I worked with, I'd have gotten out a long time before I did. This might sound like the understatement of the century to some of you, but police officers are not well liked in the city of Los Angeles. We had our supporters, don't get me wrong, but they're not nearly as vocal as our detractors. And then the people that really, really love cops tend not to be the most well-adjusted of folks, I guess. Ed Kemper loved cops, and look how he turned out. My point being, you were working in an incessantly hostile environment where sometimes your own superiors pose more of a threat to your career than the people trying to shoot you, stab you, or run you over. You also see a lot of crazy stuff, way more than your brain can safely handle, and you see it on a daily freaking basis, to be honest with you. It raises the entire bar for what you consider to be stressful or scary, so there's only been a handful of instances during my law enforcement career that actually really frightened me. And as much as this might sound like a cop-out when I definitely have some weirder, more outlandish stories, the scariest for me personally was the time I got shot. It seems like an obvious one, but some guys take a bullet without even really knowing what happened. Gunfights can start so quickly that some cops are never faced with that "oh God, I'm about to get shot" moment. Whereas me, I wasn't so fortunate. The day it happened, me and my partner were cruising through some V&E territory in East LA, headed over to a call for trespassing on some teenagers from a parking lot. The owner said that they were causing trouble and wanted them gone, and I honestly thought the call would make for an easy start to our shift. But as soon as he rolled into the parking lot, I recognized a few faces that immediately put me on alert. Most of the kids that we would say were trespassing were just that, kids around the ages of 10 to 13, but then among them were a few kids in their mid to late teens who I recognized as being V&E, or little homies. Now, quick primer, V&E stands for Barrio Nuevo Estrada, a Hispanic street gang which came from Boyle Heights way back in the 40s and 50s, and since then, they've become one of the biggest gangs in all of LA, and they have had a hand in most of the violent street crime that takes place in East LA, Montebello, and Lancaster. To say that they're a royal pain in the butt for anyone who works east side would be an understatement, so any chance we got to take a few of them off the street was one we grabbed with both hands. The way I saw it at the time, it was like an ongoing war of attrition. Even if we nabbed a few of their little homies on some stupid charge, it still cost the sets and bail money because, more often than not, they were needed to do things that the big homies couldn't do because of parole restrictions. If these guys had so much as baggies on them or didn't immediately move on after we commanded them to, we could take them in, file some paperwork for the day, then get a pat on the back from the desk sergeant before noon. And back then, it was all about keeping the desk sergeant happy. Anyway, we got out of our car and started walking over to the kids, who immediately started walking away in different directions. I just kept my eyes on the older kids, calling out for them to come back and talk to us, while at the same time preparing myself for a foot chase. If they all walked off like that, they were definitely in possession of something they shouldn't have been, in which case, it was going to be an easy collar. I called out to the kid one more time before he rounded a corner, and I just instinctively knew to run. Lo and behold, he'd started sprinting as soon as he'd broken line of sight, but I was way faster than him, and I gained a lot of ground very quickly. Now, I've obviously got my eyes on the kid, but what I'm looking for is any signs of him throwing or reaching for anything. Most likely, he's going to try and toss his stash somewhere he might be able to find it later, but there's also the chance that he might have some kind of weapon on him. I didn't think this kid had a gun on him, and even if he did, I doubted that he was brave enough to use it, or rather, I hope he wasn't stupid enough to try. I keep chasing this kid down a few side streets, then he breaks across an intersection into a residential neighborhood with what looked like a row of boarded-up houses. I followed him up to one, and he pulls the boards off the back door before running inside. He did this way too easily, and the boards all came off as one, meaning this was some kind of pre-designed means of concealing an entrance. My first thought is, boom, stash house. Because I honestly figured the kid had been dumb enough to lead me back to the local stash house. It turns out, he'd done just that, but he didn't mind letting a cop inside that day, because if his plan worked, I'd never be getting out. Like I said, I chased him into the buildings, only to discover that someone had knocked a bunch of holes into the walls to create a kind of rat run through the 3 buildings. Kinda smart for a bunch of Vario boys, but I still didn't figure this kid's endgame, so I just continued to follow wherever I heard his footsteps. I follow him into one building, then the other, then I realize I can't see him, and that there's nowhere else to run. I have him trapped, basically, which could be very volatile if it was anyone else, but I really thought that I could talk this kid down and get him to give himself up. So I tell him just that. He's surrounded, and that no one wants to get shot today, so just take the charge, get bailed out, and play the whole game all over again tomorrow. Not in those exact words, but you get the idea. If a guy is defiant, he'll usually make that clear with a loud "F you, puerco," or something along the 21st century equivalent of "You'll never take me alive, coppers." But this kid was silent, which encouraged me. Silent means scared, and scared means there's a good chance that he'll just give himself up. There was just one problem. The kid wasn't in the section of the building that I was in, but I only realized that when I heard him moving behind me through the hole in the wall that I just scrambled through. I turned, just in time to see him pointing his gun at me, and if he hadn't have insisted on shouting "Southside Sangra" or something, I honestly think that I've been a dead man. I had just enough time to sidestep, hoping it didn't affect my accuracy too much, but as we both started shooting, I got hit right away, and most terrifying for me was the fact that I got shot in the face. I knew one of the kid's bullets had struck me in the face because it spun my head before I hit the ground. As soon as I landed, I could feel all this blood and smashed up bone in my mouth, and I knew it was bad. But right there in the moment, my only concern was to make sure that he couldn't get any more shots off on me to finish the job. I tried to get up, but I had problems keeping my balance, so I just kept my gun trained on the hole in the wall where I figured that he was going to shoot from again, then got on my radio and tried my best to call for help. I say tried my best, but I couldn't get any real words out. I was trying to talk around all this blood and smashed up God knows what, and none of it was making any sense. If it wasn't for my partner having seen where I had ran after the kid, no one would have known where I was, and I know I would have been in way more trouble. I didn't know this, but the kid had taken one of my bullets, ran into the street, and collapsed right there. Without knowing that, I'm just basically sitting there, waiting for this kid to appear to finish me off, and I'm hoping I can get him first before he gets me. It made for the scariest moments of my whole life, let alone my law enforcement career. I was holding my face together with one hand, thinking that I was about to pass out any second from blood loss. I really did think that I was going to die. Hearing my partner's voice getting louder as he got closer is probably the closest thing to a religious experience I'll ever have. The word Savior comes to mind, and it's no wonder we assign that word to Christ so much, because when someone really does save your life, they're like Mom, Dad, God, and Jesus all rolled into one. Thinking about that moment gets me to the closest point possible to break down, because I know I'll never pay my partner back, even if I live to be 100. I'm sure by now, a lot of people are going to be wondering how in God's name I survived getting shot in the head. Well, that's because the bullet struck about half an inch from the left corner of my mouth. It broke all my teeth, then shattered my jaw, before exiting harmlessly through the fleshy part of my upper neck. It was one of the most miraculous gunshot wounds that somehow avoids everything vital while still being extremely debilitating in terms of path to recovery. After the doctors finished putting my face back together, I had to have a ton of dental work done after having extensive reconstruction work on my jaw, and all in all, I was in and out of the hospital for 18 months and out of the job until I was signed off as mentally and physically fit. It took almost 2 years to get back into uniform, and almost everyone down at the department wanted to help make that happen. But if I'm being honest, they shouldn't have let me go back out there. They knew I wasn't ready, but I needed to work, and they needed good cops. Or cops that had at least once been good police. I lasted a few weeks in a patrol car before I had my first panic attack, and even that seemed an impressive feat to some of the PTSD experts I talked to later. But once I had a breakdown on the job, I knew I had to just give up the ghost, as they say. I couldn't be police anymore, and as painful as it was, I just had to accept it. I used to be a cop here in Australia, New South Wales to be specific. I joined after getting kicked out of the army on a medical discharge. There was no chance of me getting back in, and back when I found out that I could try for the police after rehabbing my knee, I reckoned policing might be the next best thing to being in the army. I still wanted the adrenaline. I still wanted to chase bad guys, but the only thing I didn't figure was that the kind of action I'd see as a police officer was way more frightening than any I had in the army. I think the scariest confrontations were early on in my career when I was still feeling the job out. I'm not a small bloke, I'm just over 6 foot, about 100 and a bit kilograms, not exactly a pushover, but every so often I came across someone even bigger than I was, where the intimidation factor just didn't apply. Most of the time, the bloke was a good one, and there was nothing dramatic about my encounters with these gentle giants. But every so often, you caught one in a bad mood, and it rarely ended well. So, with this incident in question, we had arrived at the scene of a suspected domestic violence incident, and since no one was coming to the front door, we decided to go around the back to have a gander through the rear windows. I'm being really bloody cautious as I'm moving because the bloke whose house it is actually known to the cops, and we'd already heard his description over the radio heading in there. And the bloke was huge, just shy of 7 foot and 180 kilos, an absolute monster. So ideally, we wanted to get the situation sorted without any sort of confrontation with him, obviously. Now, keeping in mind that this is at 2 in the morning as well, so it's all dark as I'm walking down the side of this bloke's house. Whatever argument occurred seemed to have ceased, and the whole place is dead silent apart from a few ambient nocturnal noises. I hear something moving behind me on the concrete slab path, and I turn thinking it's my partner coming to back me up. Instead, I see our Samoan bloke, shovel in hand, raising it above his head. I didn't find out until later that his missus had broken his jaw with some kind of gardening tool, so in the low light, his face just looked all wrong. One side of his mouth was hanging a little lower, giving him this weird, unnatural-looking grimace as he lunged forward and took a swipe at me with his shovel. The positioning meant that there was no chance of me being able to discharge my weapon, as it would put the occupants of the surrounding houses at risk. So, and I appreciate how this makes me sound, but I just ran. I almost fell over in the process of dodging his second swing, but I put a little distance between us, and then just ran around the house and jumped over the side gate. There was no way he was climbing over that gate, so I bought us a little time, but then, seconds later, he comes barreling out of the side that I originally walked down and started swinging at my partner with a shovel. She was this 5'0" girl in her 20s, a great cop, just not in the position to take this guy on. But luckily, having heard all of the commotion, she had her OC, or pepper spray, ready to rock as the bloke came around the corner, and after a couple of more wild swings, he dropped the shovel and started rubbing his eyes. He pretty much put himself on the ground at that point, and after we told him that we'd get him some water for his eyes, he actually let us put the cuffs on him. The guy's wives told us that the argument had started because this big Samoan guy had tried to force his 12-year-old son to down a shot of Bundaberg rum because, quote, it would make him a man. She tried to stop him. He attacked her, and she just hit him with some gardening tool or something and broke his jaw, then actually managed to get him locked out of the house. The one crucial piece of information we were neglected to be told before he actually rocked up on the place. It still gives me the creeps to think how he just watched us from the darkness, that I'd somehow walked past this guy, that large, just crouched in a nook or behind his wheelie bins or something. We just had no idea why he was acting so violent. His wife even said that it was totally out of the ordinary. He was a bit of a crim, but not a wife-beater or a child abuser, so why the sudden switch? And we didn't find out until we got out of the hospital. He only went in to get his jaw fixed, but during the x-ray, the doctors noticed something else. Some bloody great brain tumor they suspected had been affecting his behavior. It turned out he basically needed emergency surgery to remove it, or he was going to die. So, as crazy as it sounds, this guy's arrest ended up saving his life in a way. They had to wait until he was out of the hospital and all recoup before they actually took him to court, and because of the mitigating circumstances, i.e. the big growth that had been in his head, he got off with little more than a warning. It helped that he turned up to court with a surgical scar still showing, and at that stage, I'm almost certain that there was no need for it to be on show, but I suppose his lawyer was just on the ball when it came to making an impression on the jury. After that little encounter, everything else I had to deal with seemed easier, and that feeling stayed like that for months, until my next run-in with a not-so-gentle giant. But that's a story that'll have to wait for another time. I grew up in Baltimore, but I spent most of my adult life as a police officer out in the country. This means I sometimes operate in some very rural areas, and this brings a whole other level of criminality than the city. It also means a whole other level of weird, too, and possibly one of the weirdest and creepiest calls came about a man trespassing out near the county line. The complaint was that someone was wandering around private land, yelling and screaming, and the owner wanted them gone. But then when we arrived at the property, I knew this one was going to be different. The house still had their Christmas lights up, still switched on and burning electricity on a mid-July afternoon. As soon as we got out of the car, a haggard-looking lady in her 50s emerged with a little kid in tow. It was a sad-looking scene. The woman looked tired, really, really tired, and the kid was dragging a little oxygen tank behind him. The lady explains that she's not related to him, but that she was taking care of them because their dad is off on some meth binge. At the point she called, he was right in the middle of his binge, had realized his kids had been put into the care of a woman we were talking to, and long story short, he wanted them back. Since the kid's father wasn't there at the time, there wasn't much we could do about the trespassing situation, so after giving her my personal cell phone number so she could get a direct line if he came back, I had no choice but to leave her. The whole thing happened again a few days later, and I suggested getting one of those doorbell cams or some kind of surveillance system so we at least had evidence of him breaking the law. But with the woman's dire financial situation, there was no chance of her being able to purchase anything of the sort, so, again, I just had to walk away and hope things didn't get any worse. Much like the first time, I left feeling troubled, but it wasn't the impending threat of a binging meth head that had me concerned. It was the behavior and appearance of the potential female victim. The woman seemed to be more exhausted than when I'd first seen her, and although I initially put this down to the stress of her situation, the more I thought about how she looked and how she acted, the more I began to think something else was going on. I didn't figure that she was tweaking. It wasn't that kind of weird, but again, I just put it down to stress and moved on. We got a couple of more calls like that, with different officers heading over to talk to her, and from what I heard, each time this woman is getting progressively worse. I mean, even to the point where we figured that she was just chronically ill or something. Finally, we get another call from that same house, only this time, it's the kid with the oxygen tank calling. The dispatcher said the poor little guy was in tears, saying his auntie was acting scared and that he was scared that she was going to hurt him. Me and another officer just broke the sound barrier trying to get out there in time, and I felt sick with guilt that I hadn't got the kid into temporary care while I had the chance. Thankfully, the woman hadn't hurt the kid at all by the time we got there, but she was acting completely manic, refused to calm down, and in the end, we had to call it a 5150, which is when someone is having a mental health crisis and needs urgent care. Once the woman was on her way to the hospital, and the kid was on the way to temporary foster care, we decided to search the house, just to make sure that there was no narcotics on the premises. The place looked fine, a little messy with some eccentric decor, but there was nothing that led us to believe that the home was unsafe for a child. There was no sign of any narcotics use. There was plenty of food in the fridge, and there was even a bunch of medications and spare oxygen tanks for the kids, so she was obviously taking care of him. So, what happened to make her just snap like that? The answer came to us very personally and very unexpectedly when, as we were exploring the house, the other officer I was with started to complain of feeling woozy. I've been feeling kind of the same way, but I tried to ignore the sensation as best I could so I could get on with the job. We both head out into the porch to get a breath of fresh air, and what do you know? After a few minutes, the wooziness clears right up. On a hunch, the officer I was with asked me if I'd searched the basement yet. I told him no because it was a real mess down there, and I was going to wait until he was free so we could get in there, clear some of the debris, and take a proper look around. We're down there for no more than a few minutes when my fellow officers identified what the issue was. The moment he laid eyes on an old gas-powered water heater, he made a beeline for it, putting his ear right up against the outer casing while telling me to keep quiet for a second. He stayed there for a moment or two, then made a rush back for the stairs saying, "We need to get out of here." With a suspected carbon monoxide leak on our hands, we called hazmat and poison control to advise on carbon monoxide poisoning. They told us to just keep everyone out of the house, including the kid, who had avoided the same gradual poisoning the woman had because of the little oxygen tube that he had running up to his nose. I was confused as to how being poisoned like that hadn't just killed her, as I heard about other carbon monoxide leaks being outright fatal. But according to the hazmat guys who tested the concentrations in the house, it was just enough to increasingly poison the woman over time, while having little to no effect on the young kid with the oxygen tank. The other thing I heard was that the woman wasn't getting out of the hospital anytime soon, and this is the part that really scares me about this whole incident. Although the levels of carbon monoxide in her system had gone down, the effects of the poisoning on her brain would last a lot longer. And from what I heard, she pretty much went straight from the hospital to a robust psychiatric clinic in the city. And from what I heard, the sick kid's mother wasn't around, so he ended up in foster care. Another one lost to the system, with only the small consolation of knowing that he'd get the care he needed. I drove past that lady's place the other night and I saw that all the Christmas lights were off, and I found myself thinking about her and praying that one day those lights might flicker back on. For most of the 1990s, I worked for Riverside Police Department here in Southern California. One night I was working alone on an unusually chilly October evening when a call came in about a drunken, disorderly incident at a local bowling alley. I figured that it'd be your average drunken argument over a bowling game or something, and you'd be surprised at how heated amateur bowling leagues can get. But when I arrived on scene, I discovered that there was nothing regular about what I was about to face. Running around the parking lot of the bowling alley was a half-dressed man who appeared to be attacking cars. I feel I should remind you that it was almost 40 degrees at the time of my arrival, but even in the low light of the parking lot, I could see my suspect was heavily perspiring. Right away, I knew this wasn't a regular drunk call. This guy was on something else. I got out of my car, walked over to him, and unsuccessfully attempted to engage him in conversation. All he wanted was violence. Dilated pupils, blank stare, couldn't keep still. Even when I pulled out my collapsible baton to show him that I was ready for it, he still didn't back down, and that's when his symptoms started to look very familiar to me. I hadn't dealt with the perp myself, but we booked a guy not long before who was acting in a very similar way, and blood tests came back positive for PCP, something I've heard of but I'd never actually seen anyone under the influence of until that day. It took 4 or 5 officers just to get him booked and into his cell, and then there was me, all alone, facing a suspect that had to be 100 pounds heavier than our first perp, and at least a foot taller too. Officers who've dealt with suspects under the influence of PCP will understand what an incredibly dangerous situation I found myself in. But for those that don't know anything about PCP, time for a swift and much-needed science lesson. The drug prevents a neurotransmitter called glutamate from attaching to its receptor in the brain. The user then experiences out-of-body style sensations caused by the drug's dissociative effects. Some describe feeling like they're floating or being under the impression that the world around them isn't real. Others experience an intense sense of euphoria and invulnerability, and all that from a drug that was first intended as an anesthetic. It all depends on how much a person takes, but those hallucinogenic dissociative effects can last anywhere from 3 to 6 hours, and during that time, the user is in a very vulnerable and volatile state. The come down is even worse. Depression, anxiety, mood swings. It's a bad scene for everyone involved. As soon as I realized the suspect was on PCP, I started to put away my baton. Not just because I was hoping to peacefully de-escalate things, but I could beat the brakes off this guy all night long and he wouldn't even feel a thing, so the baton was absolutely pointless. To trace and placate a suspect in that condition, our department taught us to always tell a distressed, frantic, or manic person that we were going to get them help. I found those words can have an incredibly placating effect on people suffering through manic episodes and the like. They don't see you as the enemy anymore. You're a friend, there to help, even if helping them means tasering and cuffing them before they hurt themselves or others. In this case, help meant calling in as much backup as possible, and the suspect showed absolutely zero positive reaction to my "get you help" line, so I knew that backup would be sorely needed. I was told that I'd have to wait a good 5 or 10 minutes for any backup, and I prayed that in that time, that things weren't going to get any worse. But not only did it get worse in just a few short minutes, it went completely sideways. The second I tried to re-engage the guy, just on the off chance that he was ready to calm down, I immediately paid for it. The suspect lunged at it. It made it scarily obvious that he was trying to grab my sidearm. I knew I had to keep him from getting my pistol at all cost, even if it meant getting the crap beaten out of me. A bloody nose or broken jaw would pale in comparison to what would happen if he were to somehow get a hold of my sidearm. Fortunately, there were 2 things going in my favor. The first was that our department had only recently issued retention holsters as standard equipment, and retention holsters serve the same purpose as regular holsters, but with one exception. Instead of simply lifting the gun out of the holster like you'd normally do, you gotta kind of twist and pull at the same time to be able to unholster the weapon. Thankfully, I'm pretty sure that he didn't know anything about our newfangled retention holders, but it was still a miracle that he didn't just destroy the mechanism with pure brute strength. My suspect had to at least been 300 pounds soaking wet, and either he did some serious lifting or PCP really does give people super strength, because I was convinced that he was about to disarm me on 2 very frightening occasions. However, a second thing was going in my favor also. Even though the fight was a complete weight mismatch, and I was never going to win it without some kind of weapon, the guy was so fixated on my gun that he didn't physically attack me too much. If he had, I'd have been completely screwed, and there's a chance that I wouldn't be here to tell you all this story, but luckily, his fixation meant that I was able to get him in a kind of top-down bear hug before I threw myself sideways onto the ground. The ad hoc suplex worked just enough to knock the wind out of the suspect, but then remember what I said about PCP's effects on the human body's nervous system? Well, I finally got to see this side effect firsthand, and it was absolutely terrifying. No amount of punching and bar holds or pressure point manipulation even slowed this freak of nature down, and it took all I had just to get a grip on this guy so I could hold on for dear life and keep him from getting up again. The whole time, he remained determined to get his hands on my weapon, and he was literally telling me how he was going to kill me with it when he finally got a hold of it. I'm not sure how long it took the cover unit to finally show up, but it was probably a case of 5 minutes feeling like an hour. Fortunately, the officers in the other unit immediately recognized the situation upon their arrival and helped me hold the drug-crazed nutjob down while security guards from the bowling alley, who emerged from hiding once several cop cars were on the scene, contacted a paramedic unit under our orders. Upon the paramedics' arrival, it took no less than 5 of us to apply restraints to the suspect. We were actually forced to hog-tie him in order to safely place him in the back of a squad car, and only then we were able to transport him to a medical facility for treatment and evaluation. A subsequent search revealed that he was also armed with a 4-inch blade, and once again I had to count my blessings as I wondered why he didn't use it. Once it was all said and done, my watch commander ordered me back to the station to take a rest and start my report. And good thing too, because that was probably the longest 10 to 15 minutes of my life at that point, and I was worn out. For the first time in my life, someone had actually tried to kill me, and I don't think I'm skilled enough as a writer to properly communicate what that feels like. I feel like I could spend all day trying and failing to properly sum it up, but I think the easiest way to explain it is that one day, you wake up, and the world doesn't seem quite as bright anymore, and you see it for the dangerous and unpredictable place that it truly is. I'm a homicide detective for an unlucky 13 years, and out of all the crime scenes I've seen, this is the one that stuck with me the most. One night, at about 1 a.m, some 19-year-old kid was attempting to climb up to the second-floor apartment window of his then-girlfriend. We later found out that she thought the idea was very romantic, and so the boyfriend had tried to surprise her one night. Yet unbeknownst to Romeo, his girlfriend's father was still awake, and upon seeing him climb onto their first-floor balcony, had assumed that he was some kind of home invader headed for his little girl's room. Romeo was shot point-blank, causing him to fall 20 feet to the ground. Then, once he was lying there in a twisted heap of bones, his potential future father-in-law stood on his balcony and unloaded his revolver into the poor kid's body. Up to that point, everything that occurred was just some stupid tragedy, but everything that happened after that, that's where the horror really comes into it. Instead of then calling 911 to report what he'd done, the girl's dad reloaded his weapon, then unloaded all 6 bullets into the kid's body again, all while his daughter was watching from the balcony above. We talked to the neighbors above and below afterwards, and they said the screams could have woken the dead. I've seen bodies in much worse condition than Romeo's, but seeing him on the ground, face up with literally half his face blown off and chest cavity blown wide open, I think this was one of the most hideous, if not overkill incidents I'd ever seen. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. Back when I was a newly minted police officer, I was on patrol near a strip mall when I got a call regarding an ongoing assault near the mall's front parking lot. I was on the scene in seconds, and as I pulled up, I saw that one of the two men involved in the fight had a long iron pole in his hands. As I got out of the car, he raised up as if though he was ready to strike another man to the ground with it. The other was looking up at him, hands raised in terror as he begged the armed man to reconsider. Now, this was before tasers became standard issue for departments across the country, and arguably, I had every right to use my weapon since such a large, sturdy pole definitely constituted a lethal weapon. However, I was brand new on the job, and there was a whole mob of people watching from the mall's front entrance, and I figured that I tried defusing it through force of will before I'd sent anyone to the hospital. I ran up to what I figured was minimal safe distance, drew my pistol, and then screamed at the armed man to put the pole down. At first, he stopped, lowering the pole as he looked over to me, and I was just about knocked out of my boots when he actually started to smile at me. I might have been very much a rookie at that stage, but I'd still been involved in my fair share of pursuits and arrests. Generally speaking, criminals aren't happy when the cops show up, so having this guy seem happy to see me was jarring to say the least. Still pointing my weapon at him, I repeated my order to drop the pole, but instead of complying, he just breathlessly panted, "Thank God you're here," before pointing down at the terrified-looking victim who was still just laying there, visibly shaken from how scared they were. The guy with the pole then started telling me how I needed to arrest his potential victim, and to just keep him from striking out, I decided to humor him and ask him what the guy had done. This is when Pole Guy, who was clearly suffering from some kind of manic episode, launches into a grand paranoid speech about how they had been stalking him, and how the guy he was about to attack was one of them. On more than one occasion, I asked who they were, but he seemed incapable of giving me any kind of coherent answer that didn't just descend into conspiratorial psychobabble. I knew that I was in over my head, but I also knew that dispatch had routed another unit to the scene right around the same time I'd gotten the call. Backup would be arriving at any minute, and all I had to do was hold on to the ball long enough so the big dogs could bring her over the line. It was the first big test in terms of preventing life-threatening injury to an apparently innocent party, and up until that point, I thought I'd done pretty good. But things took a sudden turn for the worse when, out of nowhere, the pole guy's expression went from friendly to hostile. Silently, he started to study my face intently for a few seconds, and considering I couldn't get the guy to shut up just a few seconds ago, I found his silence to be very disconcerting. As he turned away from the grounded man altogether and turned to face me with the pole still in his grip, I tried to ask if he was okay, but he cut me off with some comments about silent words. I only half heard what he said, so I asked him to repeat himself. And I swear to God he looks me dead serious before he repeats with emphasis, "Don't you talk to me with no silent words." It was only then I realized how dangerous that man really was. He was a violent schizophrenic, and although I wish God's mercy on each and every sufferer of that god-awful disease, they are very dangerous to be around whenever they're in an anxious or manic state. It's clear that this man could hear something that I couldn't, and it meant that he went from happy to see me to downright hostile in just a few seconds. I quickly went from feeling quietly confident about myself to downright terrified that I was going to have to use my weapon in anger for the first time. Don't get me wrong, I knew I was going to have to use it eventually, but if I was going to shoot someone, I wanted it to be some heavily armed human trafficker or something, not someone in dire need of mental health assistance. I kept trying to talk louder than the voices in his head, which I know sounds stupid in retrospect, but all I wanted in the world was to see this guy on the ground in cuffs, without any extra holes in him. I kept trying to work into his mindset by telling him that I was there to help, and I'd even arrest the guy he was referring to if he'd only put the pole down and step away from the situation. The guy on the ground didn't freak out or anything. I think he knew it was just a bluff. Instead, he tried to seize the chance to escape. But the pole guy noticed, and it made him incredibly angry. Keep in mind that it takes a few seconds for the guy on the ground to actually find his feet, but in that time, pole guy noticed the movement and swung around with the pole as hard as he could. Almost the very end of the pole smashed into the side of the grounded guy's head, right where his ear was, and it knocked him sideways onto the ground again. The guy then raised the pole above his head so high that it was clearly going to be an execution strike. I had no choice but to shoot, and I put one right to the lower left side of his back, hoping I wouldn't hit anything vital while still putting him out of action. One shot just staggered him. 2 shots put him down, and by that point, the victim on the ground was just screaming and praying, scrambling to back away from the pole guy's fallen body. Pole guy groaned and writhed for a while, too racked with pain to say anything else. The backup unit assured me that he'd survive, said gut shots were painful and took a while to recover from, but were generally non-fatal. So you can only imagine how shocked I was when I heard back that the guy had died. Doctors said I'd severed the guy's hepatic artery with my second shot. After that, he only had about minutes in him, tops. The other guy survived, but he needed surgery to reattach part of his ear. You wouldn't think blunt force could cause such horrific injuries, just internal damage, but they do, especially around the head and face. I've been retired for a few years now, and every so often, I hear how more and more departments are putting their officers through dedicated training on how to deal with mental health crises. And if you ask me, it's a severely underfunded and underexplored area of policing, which is incredible considering how common mental health crises can be here. My only hope is that, with the right training and the right equipment, no one will have to take a life like I was forced to. No one should have to die because they're suffering through the worst day of their life, and no one should be forced to be their executioner. Way back in the early 2000s, myself and 2 of my fellow officers went to perform a welfare check on an elderly woman who hadn't been seen in a couple of weeks. She lived alone except for about 8 cats and who knows how many kittens. The moment we get close to a window, we could see what remained of her through the glass, but the stench was so extreme that they couldn't get in. In the end, the fire service had to enter with breathing gear to actually get her out. It really was that bad. She had died of natural causes apparently, but obviously the kitty brigade had gotten hungry eventually. As they waited for breathing gear to get in, my mate and his colleague were watching through the window when he shouted, "Jesus Christ, they're eating her!" And watching as the scene was slowly consumed. Probably only a few nibbles by then, but they all seemed to go on a self-imposed diet for a few days afterwards. It made the press at the time, and from what I was told, all but one of the cats had to be put down as they were so emaciated by the time the police attended. Definitely the most messed up call I'd ever attended, and since that day, I've always had a subtle but very visceral reaction to the sight of a cat eating its dinner. Back in the fall of 1979, I was assigned to the Accident Investigation Unit on the afternoon shift when I was dispatched to a car/pedestrian accident in a residential area. And when I arrived, I found a female subject in her early 30s lying on the sidewalk wearing only her underwear, covered in blood, and deceased. A short examination revealed 2 hole wounds on her back. And while I was with her, a neighbor who was standing on his porch pointed to an open door on a 2-story townhouse, yelling to me, "She ran out there." It was then obvious that this was not a car accident, but some type of assault that had become a murder. As I got to the front door of the townhouse, I could see blood on the front stoop, blood inside on the floor, and bloody handprints coming down the stairway from the second floor. My backup arrived, looked at the victim with the holes, and said he thought she looked like she'd been shot. I yelled into the townhouse, got no response, so we determined that we had to see if the suspect was still inside. The neighbor told us that the victim and her husband lived there. While my partner went to search the ground floor, I started up the stairs. From the bloody handprints, it was obvious that the lady had run down the stairs after being injured and out onto the sidewalk where she died. All I could think of was this lady was shot and the husband was still on the second floor. I was in the narrow hallway, slowly making my way up the stairs, feeling the suspect would step around the top step and start shooting or something. I remember my heart was pounding so hard that I thought I could hear it. Dead silence, though. I had my gun drawn and pointed up the steps, but knew that if the suspect popped out and started shooting, that I would be in trouble. Anyway, I made it to the top, found blood in the hallway and in the bedroom while my partner yelled that he had him. The husband had stabbed his wife twice in her upper back while she was standing in front of the open closet. She turned and he stabbed her once more in the chest, which gave her just enough adrenaline to run down the stairs, out the door, and bleed out on the sidewalk. When my partner found the husband, he was lying on the kitchen floor, having made a feeble attempt at cutting his own wrist. Our investigation revealed that months before that afternoon, the couple lost their only daughter in a car/pedestrian accident in front of their home. Their marriage deteriorated, and they'd been fighting, and the husband snapped out of grief. It was the longest stairway climb that I've ever had to make in my life. My dad used to be a state police detective, and he once told me this story after I asked him what the most messed up thing he'd heard or seen on the job was. He said it happened when he was still fairly new on the force, and he got a call to an apartment building because a man in a Halloween mask was trying to get into someone's apartment. He then finds out that a call had been placed around the same time from the same apartment building, with the caller claiming they'd heard a gunshot coming from the apartment above. The original caller had described someone pounding on their door, then when they opened it, a man in what they described as a monster mask was standing there, making scary noises while trying to get into their apartment. They claimed to have kicked the guy out before slamming the door, but the guy kept on banging on the door a while before moving on to other apartments. The caller also said that they had heard more screams from down the hall, so the monster may have been trying to get to other people. When my dad got to the building, he found a man shambling around inside, covered in blood, and he got the guy turned around and realized that he had found his monster. The guy had attempted to take his own life by putting a gun under his chin and firing upwards. However, he had screwed the angle up and blown off his jaw and part of his nose, but he was still alive and in extreme shock. He had been walking around the building knocking on doors trying to get someone to help him, but his bloody torn-up face had everyone terrified, so they kept slamming the door in his face to get away. My dad said it was the last part that really got to him, how someone in their time of need could be turned away by so many people. Sure, they didn't ask to have something so horrifying darken their door on a weeknight, but at the same time, both he and I can't assume the despair that man must have gone through. To be so troubled that you try to check out, then be treated like a monster when you're at your lowest point in life. He said it's things like that which stick with you, and I completely understand why. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST. And there are some super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button. Or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, you may now kiss the chat.